Welcome everyone to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento and welcome. If you're joining in for the very first time, the purpose of the Practical SQL Server HA show is to provide lessons, insights, best practices, mistakes so you can avoid them, to help customers, organizations with their high availability and disaster recovery implementation, whether you're in the process of designing it, you're in the implementation and deployment phase, or you already have one, but you're struggling with the management administration. And of course, it's more than just for the customers and the companies and the organizations. It's for the people managing these implementations, okay? Whether you're a database administrator, system engineer, or you happen to be voluntold by your boss because you're the one sitting next to the server rack. I don't know anybody who would be sitting beside the server rack nowadays because most of them are inside data centers, co-location facilities, but I don't know, maybe they couldn't put you anywhere because everybody is working from home and you're forced to come to the office, so they give you a desk beside a server rack. And again, purpose of which is to help you with your high availability and disaster recovery, design, implementation, management, but more on the practical side of things, because I'm really pragmatic. I don't want to give you or share with you the lessons, insights, best practices that are a complete waste of time, because you don't have the proper resources, you don't have the proper talent, skills. So something that you can take action on, because only by taking action will you get the results that you want. So again, a little bit of an introduction there, but also because I'm practical. I really want to make sure that you're not just spending money, spending time, effort, and resources doing things just because, and not being able to justify it. All right, the week's topic, we're still in the topic, or we're still in the theme of implementation and deployment. By the way, if you're joining in for the very first time, welcome. You can look through the archives wherever you're watching this, whether you're watching it on YouTube, scroll through the different videos of the topics that I've covered in the past. LinkedIn Live, LinkedIn also archives those. Feel free to search for the topic that you need. If you have suggestions and recommendations, feel free to post it in the comment section. I do read the comment section. Sometimes I'm reading blank spaces because nobody's commenting, right? So feel free, okay? We're still in the topic of implementation, deployment, but I want to talk about this thing because if you're starting out in your career as a database administrator or systems engineer managing Microsoft Data Platform Solutions, specifically SQL Server, and then you are given the responsibility to build an availability group, chances are you have watched video tutorials, read articles and blog posts of how to build an always-on available group, even attended an event. Maybe that's a Microsoft focused event, and the presenter showed you how it's done. And most of the time, they do it using SQL Server Management Studio. So I want to talk about this topic right here, what every DBA needs to know, the hidden pitfalls for using SSMS for availability groups. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is because for the past couple of months that I've been attending and speaking at technical events, particularly Microsoft Data Platform related events, the thing that I've seen presenters do whenever they're doing demos is to showcase SQL Server Management Studio version 21. Kudos to the team building this. Really good friends of mine. In fact, I was at SQL Bits attending one of their presentations, walked up to Aaron Stellato and said, "How come I didn't see you in Seattle a couple of months ago?" Which is kind of weird. You are both in the same place, but you don't get to see each other because you're also seeing other people. And I remember the very first time that I built an always-on availability group. This was circa 2011. Microsoft released SQL Server 2012 to early adopters. They had the early adopters program back then. TAP customers, technology adoption program customers, insiders like Microsoft MVPs. We used SQL Server Management Studio back then, and up comes the wizard. Now, here's the thing though. Microsoft really did a great job when it comes to creating tools. Meaning, Microsoft created tools that made it easy for any technology professional to do X, whatever that X is. In this case, building a complex architecture like always-on available group. Run the wizard. Or let me backtrack even before I talk about my SQL Server Management Studio. Just building a Windows Server failover cluster. Open the wizard or open failover cluster management. Click on the wizard. Create cluster wizard. Provide the cluster nodes. Run the failover cluster validation. Once it completes and it didn't see any issue, you provide the network name, you provide a virtual IP address, you run through the wizard, and that's it. Makes it so easy to build a failover cluster using the tools. Same thing with SQL Server Management Studio. And like I said, I've seen the evolution. For those of you who remember SQL Server Enterprise Manager, you know, that cute Microsoft Management Console where either you use the built-in or you create your own using the MMC snap-in. Look, it's evolved, right? From Enterprise Manager back in the day, SQL Server 7, SQL Server 2000, SQL Server Management Studio to SQL Server 2005, and it has evolved throughout the years. It's fascinating how these tools and the fact that it's free. Yes, you don't have to pay for SQL Server Management Studio. It is free. Download, install, free. And you can start managing SQL Server with it. Loved it. Okay. And again, going back to the early days of building always-on availability groups, you watch somebody do presentation, walk through the wizard. They would use SQL Server Management Studio and the wizard in order to build an always-on available group solution. You put in the databases, or you select the databases, you select the replicas, making sure that they're also part of the failover cluster. You provide the listener name, you provide the IP address, you provide the credential to authenticate, you provide the endpoint. Sometimes when you are going through the wizard, you barely notice all of those things. In fact, now in my case, whenever I rarely use the wizard. The only time I would use the wizard is if I'm doing a presentation like this, showing a demo, but most of the time I don't. Not because I don't want people to use it, but because I want people to look beyond the wizard. Like I said, Microsoft really did a really good job when it comes to building tools like SQL Server Management Studio. Okay. However, and this is something that I wanted to really focus on in this talk, which I know it's a long-winded way of going through the history of how the tools have improved. The teams building these tools, they're putting a lot of time, effort, resources, listening to feedback, and of course, most of the time, they really have to prioritize the things that they need to work on. But man, we are lucky that we get these tools. We are lucky to be able to use amazing tools to build something like always-on availability groups. However, and this is, again, I want to focus on this. However, there are things that these tools are not doing. Okay, and I want to focus on these three things. Grab your pen and paper. Make sure you're taking notes, because even though you were able to build an always-on availability group solution using SQL Server Management Studio and the wizard, these are the things that it is not doing for you, nor is it telling you. The first one, the SQL Server Management Studio wizard, the availability group wizard, will not tell you about required skills. It will not tell you about the required skills. When you start to look at how you're going through the wizard and building an always-on available group, you open the wizard. First thing it will tell you, and the process has evolved as well, where in the past you need to have a failover cluster before you can even build an availability group. Now, with support for Linux, with support for read-scale availability groups, you don't need a failover cluster wizard, or rather you don't need a failover cluster. The wizard will pick up on it, and then you can pick and choose. Like, I can do a read-scale availability group and choose none, and then build the AG. You go through that, you provide a database or databases, depending on how many databases you want to put in there. You provide the listener, you provide the replicas, the endpoints, the port number, virtual IP address, all of these things. But in the process of building an always-on available group using the wizard, it does not tell you about the required skills. Now, I mentioned a couple of things in there. Failover cluster. The wizard will not tell you have to be very proficient with failover clustering, especially if your goal is high availability. Because SQL Server, and specifically always-on availability groups, rely on the Windows Server failover cluster or any cluster resource manager like with Linux, Linux SpaceMaker, or third-party cluster resource manager. SQL Server relies on the cluster resource manager to provide high availability. So it's more than just choosing whether I want Windows Server failover clustering, none, or I forgot the third option there. It's more than just that. It means whatever you choose, you need to be proficient at that particular technology. Or external. Yeah, that's the third one. Windows Server failover cluster, external, and then a none. External is when you have something like running on Linux, or DH2I, third party, where you can run SQL Server on top of a third-party cluster resource manager. None is I am running read-scale availability groups. I don't need a cluster resource manager, which means as a database administrator or even systems administrators taking care of an always-on available group, you need to be proficient with the underlying cluster resource manager. Again, Windows Server failover clustering, if that's a choice that you would put when you're building the AG, or Linux SpaceMaker, or again, something like DH2I, you need to be proficient with that. It doesn't tell you that you need to be proficient. It just tells you, hey, this is the cluster resource manager that you're choosing. And because always-on availability groups rely on the cluster resource manager for high availability, health detection, automatic failover, all of these things factor into whether or not your availability group remains online. If you're not proficient with these technologies, or maybe you're in an organization where you have segregation of duties and you're only taking care of the underlying database engine, like the SQL Server instance and the databases underneath, then you do need somebody who is proficient with the cluster resource manager technology, again, whether that's Windows Server failover clustering, Linux SpaceMaker. You need to have somebody who's proficient with that technology or that platform that also understands always-on availability groups. Okay, it's not just one or the other. It has to be both. I've seen cases where, especially in large organizations where they have segregation of duties and silos, DBAs take care of the databases, systems engineers take care of the operating system, and in this case, failover clustering. The DBA, you in this case, need to be proficient with Windows Server failover clustering. You don't need to be doing that on a daily basis because you have a totally different team taking care of that. But the Windows Server failover clustering platform, or the sysadmins, the engineers taking care of that platform, need to understand how failover clustering interacts with SQL Server to provide high availability for your SQL Server databases. The fact remains that less than 40% of systems engineers or systems administrators who take care of failover clustering know how it works when it comes to working with availability groups. Unfortunately, the data speaks for itself. Whenever a systems administrator taking care of failover clustering, or sometimes even the virtualized platform, when they do their regular maintenance, they don't even think about the workload that's running in there. And I say workload, I mean SQL Server. They would do their normal patching. They would patch every single node at the same time, reboot them at the same time, or sometimes they would just reboot, schedule reboots. Okay, although in most cases it's not done during normal business hours, but they don't understand that it won't automatically fail over, meaning SQL Server, the always on available group, will not automatically fail over unless certain conditions are met. And they wonder, hey, how come the databases are offline? Well, you didn't bother checking if those prerequisites are met as part of automatic failover when you reboot the node that is currently running the AG. So again, the wizard will not tell you about these required tech skills. And and all I'm talking about here is the cluster resource manager, like failover clustering. I haven't even talked about networking, right? Your failover cluster nodes talk to each other. So how do they talk to each other? Carrier pigeons? Probably not. They're using the network. They're using the network to send and receive messages so that they can talk to each other. That's another tech skill that you need to be proficient in. I'm not saying you have to be an expert. I'm just saying you have to know the basics and the fundamentals of those technologies in order for you to be proficient enough to put pieces together to understand how always-on available groups work. But yes, unfortunately, SQL Server Management Studio is not going to tell you about those required skills. That's one. The second one is that the SQL Server Management Studio, the wizard in and of itself, will not create operational processes. Okay, it will not create operational processes. Going back to what I mentioned earlier, in large companies where you have segregation of duties, the database administrators will take care of the databases, systems engineers and sysadmins will take care of the failover cluster. I did mention that you need to have somebody who is proficient with the cluster resource management technology that you are going to use for always-on availability groups. And they need to be aware of how the cluster resource manager interacts with SQL Server and vice versa. Okay, so if something goes wrong, let's say I'm a DBA or you're a DBA, something went wrong with SQL Server, you raised a ticket. Well, if you don't have an operational process in place, well, you can raise that ticket and nobody picks it up after 4 hours. And now your databases are offline, but nobody's looking at the ticket. Okay? Because even if you can build an always-on availability group, even if you were able to launch it in production, I don't know why I said launch, or promote it to production, it's now, in a production environment, the wizard is not going to create your operational processes for you. I wish it did. I wish it can read my mind. Or I wish, because I don't have an operational processes yet, I wish it would create it for me, write the documentation, and tell every team how it's supposed to be done. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why AI is never going to replace me. Whatever AI can do, it's never going to replace me. Why? Because I have to create the operational processes by understanding how teams work. Going back to the example of being in siloed organizations where you have segregation of duties. If I, the DBA, have to worry about my databases being offline, and as a side effect, figured out that it was a problem with my failover cluster, I have to create the ticket, raise that ticket, forward it to the team taking care of the Windows Server failover cluster, or Linux SageMaker, or whatever kind of cluster resource management. And I have to make sure that we have service level agreements in place so that the ticket is not sitting there for 7 hours and not being looked at. These are the types of operational processes that you will have to create in order for your databases to stay online. The wizard is not going to do that for you. Even if you have SSMS 21 with Copilot enabled, it is never going to create operational processes for you. Okay? You have to be clear on what those operational processes are. And this is primarily driven by responsibilities. Or not just responsibilities and expectations. Okay? Responsibilities meaning if I'm poor me, I'm the one-man shop where I take care of everything. My responsibilities involve taking care of SQL Server, taking care of the failover cluster, taking care of Windows, taking care of VMware if I'm running on VMware. Oh, by the way, racking and stacking the servers in the data center. Oh, by the way, driving to the data center. So my responsibilities dictate my operational processes. In larger organizations where I'm taking care of the database, somebody else is taking care of the hardware, somebody else is taking care of VMware or my hypervisor, those responsibilities dictate how my operational processes would look like. Now, remember the second part that I mentioned? In addition to the responsibilities, my expectations, or not mine, but my bosses, my customers' expectation dictate my operational processes. And I remember working as a data center engineer like more than 20 years ago. This is what we spend so much time on. We barely touch our keyboards, not because we don't do work, but we spend so much time creating operational processes because, one, again, those two things, responsibilities and expectations. There is an expectation when it comes to SLAs. We have very strict SLAs. We manage data centers all across the globe. We want to make sure that we are meeting customers' expectations as part of our service level agreement. So we don't spend a lot of time on our keyboard. We spend a lot of time whiteboarding, defining our responsibilities, defining expectations, and then creating operational processes based on those. So we spent a lot of time, again, whiteboarding, defining operational processes. That's also one of the reasons why it was easy for us to automate majority of the work that we do. And that's because, again, we already have a process in place. We know the sequence of events that need to happen. And sometimes if we need to do parallel work, we create automations framework that would do work simultaneously because they're not dependent on anything. Hence, we were able to do more work without putting in a lot of work. Okay? But again, the wizard is never going to create operational processes for you. You have to do it yourself. With your other team members, of course, with your other colleagues, especially again in larger organizations, this is a little bit more challenging. And also part of that, as I mentioned, is the expectation. If you get an alert, how would the process look like from the time you receive an alert, or even the part where is that going to be an email or is that going to be a message that gets sent to a Slack channel or a Teams channel or whatever internal communication tool that you use. That is part of operational processes. By the time you receive the message, again, whether that's an email to a mailing list, a message to a Slack channel, how do you respond? Who needs to respond? Or who is responsible for responding? Right? So responsibilities and expectations. What do you need to do based on that alert? So you create these operational processes, but the wizard will never do that for you, regardless of who tells you, oh, ChatGPT can do it. Now, you can tell it to create a process by prompting it, or whatever AI tool, prompting it based on your input of your understanding of responsibilities and expectations. So again, kudos to the Microsoft team for creating such a great tool. Unfortunately, this is not something that any tool can do for you. Okay, so SSMS will not create operational processes. The third one is, I don't want to say it's shocking for some people, or for most people, but the reality is SSMS, when you use the wizard, will not show you the real cost. And what I mean by real cost, I mean dollar values beyond licensing. Of course, you deploy a 2-node failover cluster, a 2-replica availability group, standalone instance, standard edition. Sure, you can only create basic availability groups with standard edition, but you kind of have an understanding of how much it will cost based on licensing. Basic availability groups with standard edition, X number of CPU cores, you license SQL Server, you license Windows. But I'm not even talking about that. That's a given. It's one of the reasons why customers will come up with ideas not to deploy Enterprise Edition, because it's expensive, really expensive. Okay, but again, with the wizard, it actually blocks you, by the way. Now, when you're running Standard Edition, it will block you from creating additional replicas, because it's limited to 2 replicas. It will block you because, oh, it sees that you have Standard Edition and you cannot create an availability group with more than 2 replicas using Standard Edition licensing. But again, that's beside the point. What are the costs that I'm referring to here? Remember the tech skills? First part, SSMS is not going to tell you about the required tech skills, which means if you don't know how to manage an always-on availability group before you even deploy it, you have to learn it. That's a cost. Oh, by the way, it's not just you. If you decide you want this to be highly available 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, then it requires more than one person doing that. In fact, whenever a customer would come to me, the first thing I tell them is, how many people on your team will be responsible for this? If they say I'm the only person, well, good luck. You cannot do that. Okay? It will burn you out. It would cause you a lot of frustration and a lot of anxiety, especially if I was just talking to one of my customers the other day, where if they're on call, they cannot go anywhere. They cannot go anywhere. They're stuck at home. They could go someplace where they have their phone and their laptop, plug in their laptop to their phone so that they can access their data center through a VPN. But in most cases, they don't want to worry about that because they might end up in a place where I don't have cell phone signal. If you're on call, you have to be available. That's a cost. Your availability is a cost. Another person on your team who knows about this is a cost. So that goes beyond licensing. Oh, the operational process is a cost. Why? Because if you don't have one, you have to create one. That's man-hours spent creating operational processes. Oh, the licensing, the agent for monitoring your SQL Server, for monitoring your AG, for monitoring your Windows environment. Sure, you've already paid for SQL Server licenses, but what is the point of having a high availability solution if you don't have a monitoring solution? That's a cost. Oh, by the way, the shorter your recovery point and recovery time objectives are, meaning if you want as close to 0 downtime and 0 data loss as possible, that's an exponential increase in the cost. It is. Now it's adding up, right? And I'm not even talking about the 14 byte, extra 14 byte per row on your database when you implement read-only readable secondaries. Okay, I'm going to pay for license for that, but I'm not. There's other costs outside of that. Extra 14 bytes per row on all of the tables that will be read off of your readable secondary. That's a cost. Oh, the additional CPU core, because now you're adding workloads to it, the additional memory requirements, the additional storage because of that 14 extra bytes per row. These are costs. SQL Server Management Studio, regardless of how great the tool is, will never tell you about the real cost. And it goes beyond licensing. Okay? There are hidden costs that are associated with always on available group. You have to count these costs. And it's easy, again, to fall into the trap of when your boss says, I want you to deploy an availability group, it's easy to fall into the trap of, hey, I've seen that. Somebody demonstrated it using the wizard. Oh, SQL Server Management Studio 21 is great. It's an amazing tool. Now we have Copilot as well. But these are things that your tool, again, SQL Server Management Studio, these are things that it will never do for you. It will never tell you, it will not tell you the required tech skills when you're building an always on available group using the wizard. It will not, okay? What was the second one? It will not create operational processes for you. You have to define that first. You have to make sure that it is properly defined. In fact, the first thing that I would ask customers, one of the things that I would ask a customer if they're thinking of building and deploying an always on available group, two things. One, do you have the right skills in the team? And not just the right skills, but also the right people and the number of people. And number two thing that I ask is, do you have an operational process? Because if you don't have one and something goes wrong, then you're in for a surprise. Okay? Because it doesn't matter if you have available and capable people on the team, if you have a proper escalation process in place. And I'm pretty sure you can relate to this. You open a ticket with a vendor, the vendor takes forever to respond, and your SLA is at risk. That's no different from your team managing this. And the third one, of course, is the wizard would not tell you and will not show you the real cost. I wish it was built into the tool, but that's impossible because every organization is different. Every team is different. So they would have a different team skills, tech skills within the team. They would have different operational processes, and they would have different costs based on the different skill sets and the different operational processes. So regardless of how these AI companies would tell you, oh, this is a great tool, it's never going to be able to do that. Okay, it will need your feedback. It will need your input to create an operational process, to calculate the real cost associated with building an always-on availability group, and even understanding what the different technical capabilities within your team. And if you need to staff, and if you need to either outsource the management, of course, making sure that outsourcing it to a managed services provider also meets your service level agreement. And again, I just simply call that as simple as, what's the expectation like? Okay. I love SQL Server Management Studio, don't get me wrong. I love the fact that the tool is easy to use. Try managing Oracle with third-party tools, but this is a tool that Microsoft invested in as far as the user experience is concerned. That's why it's so easy. I don't want to say it's simple. It's easy for anybody without the right technical background, with no understanding of what's going on under the covers, to build a complex architecture like always on available groups. Sadly, these tools will never be able to do these things. Excuse me. These tools will never be able to do these things. It is still your responsibility as the database administrator to make sure that you have the right tech skills. Not just you, but the other people on the team or outside of your team that are responsible for taking care of the entire stack that always on available groups rely on. You would have to define your operational processes, create operational processes, and make sure that they're properly followed. And number three, it is your responsibility to really look at the cost associated with deploying an always-on available group in your environment. hopefully that gives you a little bit of a background. And again, I'm excited for what SQL Server 2025 has to offer. I've used SSMS 21. It's great. I wish that was available from way back in the SQL Server 2000 days, but it wasn't. But the thing is, despite the fact that the Microsoft team responsible for the tools have done an amazing job, these are things that no tool can ever do. You are responsible for this, right? That is about it for this episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. And as we are coming close to release of SQL Server 2025, I'm going to introduce some features and hopefully be able to showcase some of those features and how they work and how they help you achieve high availability for your mission critical SQL Server databases. That's about it for this episode for this week. Tune in again for next week. And if you're in the process, or if you're in that stage where you're looking at deploying an always-on available group solution, or any type of SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery solution, or maybe you already have something in production, but it's causing you a lot of problems, you don't know exactly how to deal with it, or you don't have the team, or your team does not have the skills, the tech skills, required tech skills to manage a complex architecture like always-on availability groups, feel free to reach out. Use that link on the screen. Schedule what I call a strategy session where we will go through what your challenges are, what stage you are in when it comes to building a high availability solution. And then part of that is coming up with a strategy that would help you address issues, solve problems that you currently have in order for you to take advantage of whatever high availability solution you're building. Now, this would lead you to my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you. Use this link again, schedule a strategy session, and happy to talk to you about how we can be of help. Right? That is about it for this episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Again, tune in again next week for another episode. And if this was helpful, if you learned a thing or two from this episode, put in the comment section, what was the one thing that you've taken away from this entire episode? Put it in the comment section, or if you have any questions, put it in there as well. Or if you have any suggestions on what topics you want me to cover in the future, put it in the comment section as well. Happy to hear from you. All right? That's about it for this episode. Enjoy the rest of your week. I'll see you again in the next episode.